In early August 1942, a British officer named John Haselden stood before a group of men in a Cairo briefing room and told them they were going to capture Tobruk and destroy it. The room contained men who had spent 2 years in the desert. They knew what Tobruk was, a fortified Axis port 570 kilometers west of Alexandria, defended by roughly 20,000 troops, concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, wire obstacles, dense minefields, and coastal gun batteries capable of reaching far out to sea. Haselden knew all of this too. He had operated behind enemy lines more times than most officers could count. He spoke fluent Arabic, had gone in disguised as an Arab or an Italian on previous missions, and been awarded the Military Cross in October 1941 after parachuting from a Wellington bomber to observe Rommel's own headquarters at Beda Litoria. A third-generation cotton merchant's son, born near Alexandria, he was as comfortable in the desert as any man in the British Army. Formerly, he was Intelligence Corps, not SAS, not SOE, though the distinction would have seemed academic to the men who'd watched him work. Some of the soldiers in that room wore German uniforms. They were members of the Special Interrogation Group, an organization so secret its founding document, a memo dated 1st April 1942 and stamped "Most Secret," barely hinted at what it actually did. Captain Herbert Buck established the unit that spring in Egypt. He built it around German-speaking Jewish volunteers from the British Mandate of Palestine, men who had fled the Reich, many directly from Germany itself, who had then signed up to re-enter the Nazi world in disguise. The SIG's membership numbers remain disputed. Estimates range from the low teens to close to 40. But what each of them received on joining was identical. A fabricated German identity, complete with forged service documents, a cover story, and photographs of invented wives and girlfriends, built to pass through any checkpoint that asked questions. By May 1942, SIG operatives were already operating behind enemy lines on small reconnaissance missions, driving German trucks, wearing German uniforms, eating at German mess tables. Their role in the Tobruk plan was specific. They would serve as the guards escorting British prisoners of war into the city. Haselden's cover story for the overland approach rested on a calculated inversion of captivity. His force, designated Force B, would cross the Libyan desert in German-marked vehicles, with SIG operatives dressed as Africa Corps personnel escorting what appeared to be British soldiers captured near El Alamein. At the Tobruk perimeter, the convoy would look like any other after-action column returning from the front. Victorious Germans, tired prisoners, standard procedure. As Haselden put it in his own briefing, "We will enter as prisoners of war, captured at the Alamein front, under the guard of what are supposedly German soldiers." He added, with what sounds now like brutal understatement, "For 12 hours we will hold out at Tobruk." The psychological weight pressing on the SIG men wasn't something Buck recorded in operational documents, but it was plainly there. These were Jews wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. The practical consequences of capture had been understood by every man who volunteered. Hitler's commando order, formally issued in October 1942, simply codified what had always been the operational reality. Allied commandos caught behind enemy lines were to be shot. For men wearing German uniforms, men who were Jewish, the personal dimension of that threat required no elaboration. And yet they came. They drove the trucks. They wore the boots. They answered to German names they had been assigned by a British officer in Egypt. Churchill's German Special Forces, the most detailed account of the unit, described them simply as Lions of Judah. That phrase isn't excessive. These men had chosen a mission that offered capture as its most likely alternative to death. What none of them knew, not Haselden, not Buck, not a single man in that briefing room, was that the enemy had already read the plan. To understand what this operation was meant to achieve, you need to understand what Tobruk meant to Erwin Rommel in the autumn of 1942. When Axis forces captured Tobruk on 21st of June 1942, they seized a functioning Mediterranean port theoretically capable of unloading 1,500 tons of supplies per day. For an army fighting along overland supply lines stretching 1,000 miles back to Tripoli, perpetually vulnerable to Allied air interdiction, a forward port was worth more than almost any battlefield victory. Tobruk's fall yielded Rommel an estimated 5,000 tons of captured fuel, vehicles and ammunition on the day, and it sustained his momentum toward Egypt, driving his Panzerarmee Africa to within 60 miles of Alexandria. By September 1942, General Bernard Montgomery was assembling the force for the Second Battle of El Alamein, planned for mid-October. Rommel's ability to resist that offensive depended entirely on his ability to resupply. Tobruk was the valve controlling that flow. Destroy the harbour facilities, the fuel depots, the coastal guns, and you didn't merely damage Rommel's logistics, you fractured them, 6 weeks before the battle that would decide North Africa. That was what Operation Agreement promised, a single night's work that could change the arithmetic of the entire campaign. The operation British planners assembled in early August 1942 was the most complex combined raid the Desert War had yet produced. GHQ Middle East gave final approval on August 21, 1942. The raid had 4 simultaneous moving parts, grouped under the umbrella codename Operation Rosemary. Operation Caravan would send 50 long-range Desert Group men in 12 trucks and 5 jeeps against the Axis airfield at Bas, 170 kilometers south of Benghazi. Operation Nicety would strike the Jalo Oasis further to the south. Operation Bigamy, under the personal command of Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling, founder of the SAS, would raid the harbour and airfields at Benghazi with 200 men and a pair of honey tanks. And Operation Agreement, the main effort, would destroy Tobruk. The naval force committed to Agreement alone was substantial. The anti-aircraft cruiser HMS Coventry, 2 tribal-class destroyers, HMS Sikh flying the pennant of Captain St. J. A. Micklethwaite, and HMS Zulu. 4 other destroyers, 16 motor torpedo boats from the Royal Navy's 10th and 16th flotillas, 3 motor launches, and approximately 30 landing craft. Aboard those ships were approximately 350 to 400 men of the 11th Royal Marine Battalion, Force A, tasked with landing north of Tobruk Harbour and destroying port infrastructure from the waterfront inward. Force C, roughly 180 men from D Company of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders under Captain Norman McPhee, and 14 platoon from the 1st Royal Northumberland Fusiliers under Lieutenant Ernest Raymond, would ride MTBs to the coastal inlet at Mirza Shaush, east of the harbour, and attack the coastal gun positions from that flank. On land, Haselden's Force B had been moving for 6 days. The overland column, approximately 200 men including LRDG navigation teams, SAS elements, engineers, signallers and the SIG operatives, had departed from Cairo on the 6th of September, covering 2,900 kilometres across the desert in the late summer heat. The route skirted the Jalo Oasis to minimise the chance of detection by Italian desert patrols. During the approach, LRDG scouts neutralised several Italian outposts to maintain momentum. By 13th September, the column was south of Tobruk, dismounting under cover of darkness for the final infiltration. The plan required every component to arrive on time, in the right place, at the right moment. RAF bombers would hit Tobruk at 21:30, suppressing defences and providing noise cover for the approaching ships. Haselden's land force would penetrate the perimeter under their SIG cover. The Royal Marines would hit the beaches. Force C would strike from Mersa Schausch to the east. Coordinated, simultaneous, mutually supporting. The primary targets, in order of priority: harbour docks, fuel storage, coastal gun batteries, and shipping in the harbour. Captain Buck, commanding the SIG element within Force B, had quietly reduced the number of SIG operatives assigned to the mission in the days before departure. He had concluded, not confirmed, but suspected, that the Germans had become generally aware of the SIG's existence. He assigned fewer operatives than the planned 12. It was a small precaution against a vague unease he couldn't fully articulate. He was more right than he knew. 1 year before any of this, on a night in September 1941, a man named Loris Girardi walked through the US Embassy in Rome and opened a safe. Girardi was an Italian national employed at the embassy as a messenger, a position that gave him access no outside operative could have manufactured. The operation was authorized by General Cesare Ame, head of the Italian Servizio Informazioni Militare, the military intelligence service known as SIM. Ame later described its execution with remarkable casualness. All I had to do was reach for the American embassy key from my office wall. SIM operatives and Italian carabinieri specialists photographed the contents of the safe in the military attaché's office overnight and replaced everything before dawn without detection. What they photographed was the Black Code, officially designated Military Intelligence Code Number 11, a codebook with black-coloured binding used by US military attachés worldwide to encrypt their communications back to Washington. In that safe, they also found its super-encipherment tables. With both components in hand, any sufficiently capable cryptanalysis service could read every message sent on that system by any American attaché in any city in the world. The man those tables were designed to protect was Colonel Bonner Frank Fellers, the US military attaché in Cairo. A West Point graduate, experienced and conscientious, Fellers had been sending detailed intelligence assessments back to Washington since 1940. His access to the British military was remarkable. He was trusted, he was diligent, and he travelled extensively to see conditions at the front for himself. His dispatches covered British unit positions and exact locations, troop movement schedules, tank performance evaluations, supply situations and logistical shortfalls, expected reinforcement arrivals and convoy schedules, operational timelines for planned offensives, commander assessments and casualty figures. He sent specific information about which units were combat effective and which were exhausted. He reported on British shipping losses and the impact on supply ratios. He was doing his job with uncommon thoroughness. His problem was that the cipher he was using had been photographed overnight in Rome. By mid-December 1941, German cryptanalysts, the Chiffrierabteilung, had independently cracked the Black Code, working partly from materials the Italians shared and partly from encipherment tables obtained through Hungarian channels. The Italian cryptographers could decode Feller's reports within 8 hours of his transmissions. Information reached Rommel's operations staff within hours of that. A dedicated German intercept station covering Egypt was operating near Lauf, northeast of Nuremberg, processing the traffic as it came through. Rommel called the source Die gute Quelle, the good source. His senior cryptanalyst, Dr. Herbert Schadel, described what the advantage actually felt like from the inside.
By lunch each day, we knew exactly where the Allied troops were standing the evening before.
He rated it superior even to Enigma-derived intelligence for practical operational planning, because Feller's dispatches were so consistent, so current, and so specific. Whenever Feller's left Cairo for an extended tour of the front, Rommel was temporarily disadvantaged by the absence of updates, which tells you how dependent on those reports the German command had become. One account describes how Rommel's former officers recalled him relying on the information from Feller's daily dispatches when planning his Africa Corps campaigns in the first half of 1942. The access was, in practical terms, almost without parallel in the history of modern signals intelligence. For approximately 6 months, from December 1941 through June 1942, Rommel had something close to a British staff officer on secondment, not an agent, not a source prone to exaggeration or self-interest. A diligent American colonel with excellent access who sent precise, authenticated, high-quality intelligence reports on a regular schedule and had no idea anyone else was reading them. Feller's himself had sensed something was wrong. On February 1st, 1942, he formally alerted the Military Intelligence Division in Washington, noting the black code system was old and potentially insecure. His superiors reviewed the concern and overrode it. He continued transmitting. On the 17th of June 1942, after British counterintelligence had begun comparing German operational responses with Feller's recent dispatches and concluded, via traffic analysis, that the cipher had been compromised, the War Department ordered him to change codes. The radiogram carrying that order was misplaced by the Radio Corporation of America, the commercial carrier handling the transmission. Feller's didn't switch to the new SIG-ABA machine code system until June 29, 1942. The leak ended that day. He was quietly removed from the region shortly afterwards. He never knew the full extent of it. Feller's went to his grave without understanding what his cipher had cost. He wasn't censured. He was promoted to Brigadier General, the first member of his West Point class to reach that rank, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the quality of his Egypt reporting, and went on to serve as one of General Douglas MacArthur's most trusted staff officers during the post-war occupation of Japan. The Army's handling of the breach was characteristic of how institutions manage catastrophic systemic failures. Quietly, without ceremony, and without assigning accountability to anyone whose subsequent career might suffer from public scrutiny. The Feller's Channel closed on June 29, 1942. Operation Agreement didn't take place until the night of September 13th to 14th, 1942. 11 weeks separate those two dates. The specific planning for the Tobruk raid almost certainly postdated the last of Feller's compromised dispatches, and no confirmed evidence places a specific Feller's transmission, naming agreement, its date, its force composition, or its objectives. What 6 months of those dispatches had given the Axis was something harder to quantify and harder to defend against. A comprehensive, deep map of British capabilities, methods, vulnerabilities, and patterns across the first half of 1942. Rommel's intelligence picture of his opponent was extraordinarily detailed. He understood how the British organised long-range raiding operations, which units were capable of operating deep behind lines, how amphibious forces timed their approaches to naval gunfire, what the LRDG and SAS looked like in an operational context. He had absorbed months of authentic Allied supply data, tactical assessments, and operational thinking. That accumulated knowledge didn't vanish when the channel closed. It sat in Axis intelligence assessments, in garrison orders, in the institutionalized awareness of a headquarters that had spent half a year reading the enemy's private correspondence. When the Feller's Channel went dark, Rommel's Signals Intercept Company 621, a lightly armed wireless intercept unit described as among the most advanced signals technology available to German forces in 1941, continued pulling British radio traffic from the desert in near real time. British radio discipline in the North African theatre was notoriously poor throughout 1942. Tanks communicated formation movements over insufficiently encrypted frequencies. Unit commanders reported positions in ways that, to an experienced listener, built a picture of operational build-ups weeks in advance. Signals intercept had already contributed to Rommel's stunning victory at Tobruk in June 1942, with one account documenting that an Italian second lieutenant at a radio intercept unit had exploited intercepted information to enable that assault. In the weeks leading up to a coordinated four-part operation involving hundreds of men, ships, aircraft and vehicles covering multiple objectives across hundreds of miles of desert and coast, the radio traffic generated by British forces would have been considerable. Multiple accounts, including John Sadler's primary narrative history of the operation, confirm the Tobruk garrison was on high alert by the time the British arrived, and that this wasn't simply a response to the night's events. The Atlas of Special Operations records that, as it transpired later, the garrison was reinforced. Sadler states directly that the garrison was on high alert, and that a German officer, identified as Lieutenant Corner, confirmed this. Historians with access to the most detailed primary accounts have described Italian foreknowledge of the Special Forces raids as an unresolved aspect, meaning the people who knew the operation best couldn't fully account for why the defenders were so ready. One complicating voice deserves its place here. The most detailed account of the naval and marine side of the operation, Gordon Lansborough's Tobruk Commando, argues that the RAF air attack on Tobruk at 21:30, intended to suppress defences, was in fact the major contributing factor for the alertness of German forces on the night. On that reading, the garrison wasn't specifically forewarned about agreement. They were simply a well-trained force responding to an unexpected air raid with full mobilization. Both things can be simultaneously true. A garrison already operating at heightened general readiness because months of accumulated intelligence had established that British planners regarded major logistical targets as high-priority raid objectives, and because British radio traffic in the preceding weeks had indicated unusual operational preparation, would respond to an air raid not with cautious routine, but with instant, complete, pre-rehearsed battle stations. Intelligence creates conditions. An air raid provides a trigger. What happened at Tobruk on the night of September 13, 1942, was likely both at once. The honest verdict on the title's promise of one radio call is this: no single intercept, no single transmission, no discrete moment when a careless operator betrayed everything has ever been identified. What there was, instead, was a sustained, systematic failure of Allied communications security, spanning over a year, beginning with a physical break-in to a Rome embassy safe in September 1941, running through 6 months of a German field marshal reading his opponent's private assessments over lunch, and continuing through an accumulation of desert radio traffic that gave the Axis enough contextual knowledge to read British operational signals with deadly accuracy. The men of Operation Agreement weren't undone by one mistake. They were undone by dozens, spread across months, none of which they knew anything about. The RAF bombers arrived over Tobruk at 21:30 on 13th of September 1942. The intent was to suppress coastal defences, destroy gun positions, and give the seaborne force cover noise as it closed on the harbour. What the bombs actually accomplished was to light the garrison up like a signal flare. Every searchlight in the harbour district swept the sky. Anti-aircraft guns opened up from positions that had been sitting dark and quiet. The soldiers and sailors of the Tobruk garrison, already at a heightened state of readiness, moved to full battle stations. Whatever surprise remained for the seaborne force, and it was already fragile, dissolved in the light of the first explosions. At approximately 21:45, Haselden's Force B secured its initial positions south of the perimeter. The column that had crossed 2,900 kilometers of desert in 6 days was now on foot, moving in darkness through the outer edge of the Tobruk defences. The SIG operatives in their Africa Corps uniforms were at the front, the arrangement intact, the cover story holding. They reached the Tobruk perimeter wire at approximately 2 a.m. on the 14th of September. They cut through. They entered. Force B moved toward the coastal gun battery at Mersa es Schausch, east of the harbour, the battery specifically identified as their primary target. They got there. They seized it. An Italian 152mm coastal gun position, one of the weapons designed to destroy the ships approaching from the sea, was briefly in British hands. For a short while, on the night of September 13th, the plan appeared to be working. Out at sea, HMS Seek was leading the amphibious force toward the landing beaches north of Tobruk. The landing craft were in the water. Force A's Royal Marines, around 350 men from the 11th Battalion, were transferring from the destroyers in darkness, loading into the craft, checking equipment, moving with the professional quiet of men who had rehearsed this until it was automatic. Then the navigational beacons that were supposed to guide the landing craft to the correct beaches failed. In the darkness, with the coast ahead, a confusion of searchlights and gun flashes, the troops came ashore on the wrong beach. Not slightly off, wrong enough to place them directly within the effective range of shore batteries that were now fully manned, fully alerted, and whose crews had already established firing solutions on every approach corridor to the harbour. The guns opened up. Italian 152mm batteries and German 88mm guns found the ships offshore with a speed that spoke of pre-prepared firing data. HMS Seek, the flagship, was struck repeatedly. She lost steering. She lost an engine room. Captain Micklethwaite attempted to hold her at 10 knots, trying to work the damaged ship out of range, while HMS Zulu worked to get a tow line across. A Reuters correspondent named John Nixon, aboard HMS Zulu, watched her across the dark water. He later described the image that stayed with him. HMS Seek on fire, her guns still firing. The first tow line attempt failed. A shore battery shell struck the cable and severed it. HMS Zulu made a second attempt at 6:35 a.m., pushing the effort past dawn, working the tow through to 6:50 when the first German aircraft appeared overhead. Juncker's Ju-88 bombers, already on operational alert, came in low. The batteries were approximately 1 mile from HMS Seek and had her range precisely. HMS Seek sank with 122 crew killed. The survivors who abandoned ship were captured. HMS Zulu, crippled by shellfire during the rescue attempt, was subsequently lost. HMS Coventry, which had been providing anti-aircraft cover for the convoy, was bombed repeatedly during the Ju-88 attacks, set ablaze, and couldn't be saved. She was abandoned and scuttled. The smaller vessels encountered their own disasters. MTB 314 was captured at dawn by the German harbour minesweeper R-10, with 117 soldiers and sailors taken prisoner in a single action. Motor launches ML352 and ML353 were intercepted by Italian torpedo boats, Castore and Montanari, and lost. MTBs 308, 310 and 312 were destroyed by Axis aircraft during the chaotic withdrawal. Force C had a separate catastrophe entirely. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders and the Fusiliers, riding MTBS toward Mercer Schausch, found the inlet approaches covered by harbour boom defences, coastal guns and patrolling Italian torpedo boats. Most boats were repelled before fully disembarking. Small groups briefly disrupted coastal battery positions, but the landing force couldn't consolidate, couldn't advance, and couldn't coordinate with Haselden's land force, whose communications had broken down as the night deteriorated. Force C was thrown back, with most of its casualties sustained before it fully landed. On land, Force B's brief moment of success was already ending. The Italian coastal battery they had seized was retaken by Italian Marines. No reinforcement was coming from the sea, because the sea operation had already collapsed. Ammunition was running low. Haselden made his decision. He ordered his men to destroy the coastal guns before they were retaken, then break out individually and make for British lines by whatever route they could find. Then he led a charge with 5 men against encroaching Italian forces. He was killed by a hand grenade. He was 39 years old. His name is on column 85 of the El Alamein Memorial. Some SIG survivors walked through the desert for more than a month before reaching Allied territory, navigating without support across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. One SIG operative, wounded and captured, was held for 17 days. He was tortured for 5 of those days. He was subjected to a mock execution. He refused to provide any useful information throughout and was eventually transferred to a prisoner of war camp. His name doesn't appear in most accounts of the operation. The actions of men in that situation rarely do. Total Allied casualties across the sea, land and amphibious elements of agreement: approximately 746 personnel killed, wounded or captured. Around 300 Royal Marines, 166 Army troops and 280 sailors, with 576 taken prisoner. Against that, Axis forces suffered 62 killed and 119 wounded. Minimal damage was done to Tobruk's harbour infrastructure. The fuel depots were untouched. The dock facilities functioned the following morning exactly as they had the morning before. 40 miles to the west, on the same night, a version of the same story was playing out. David Stirling's Operation Bigamy, 200 men and a pair of honey tanks, the largest SAS force yet assembled, was moving on Benghazi along a road the SAS knew from previous raids. On the approach to the city, the column ran into a prepared position. Multiple accounts describe the same thing. The force was ambushed, the route characterized as a classic spot for an ambush, since once committed to the approach, the column had limited options. The SAS, who had raided Benghazi before, found the enemy waiting rather than sleeping. 2 raids the same night, both planned in Cairo with equal secrecy, both part of the same 4-operation coordinated campaign. One walked into pre-sighted coastal artillery, the other into a roadblock at a classic choke point. The only component of Operation Rosemary to achieve meaningful results was Operation Caravan, the LRDG attack on the airfield at Bas, which destroyed 16 enemy aircraft and damaged 7 more, at a cost of 4 men and 2 vehicles. Bas was smaller, more isolated, and less likely to figure prominently in any intelligence picture assembled from months of accumulated British operational patterns. The contrast holds a logic that resists coincidence. The targets that British planners had specifically identified as major disruption objectives, Tobruk, Benghazi, were both defended with unusual readiness on the same night. The peripheral target, Bas, was caught by surprise. That pattern isn't bad luck. It's consistent with foreknowledge of the central operations, however that foreknowledge was assembled. The Special Interrogation Group didn't survive the raid. After the failure at Tobruk, the unit was formally disbanded. Its surviving members were transferred to the Royal Pioneer Corps. Several later joined No. 2 Commando and continued fighting through the remainder of the war. The organisation that Captain Herbert Buck had established in a document stamped "Most Secret" on April 1, 1942, the unit of Jewish refugees who had turned the enemy's own uniform into a weapon, lasted less than 6 months as a coherent fighting force. Their most ambitious operation had sent them into a trap they weren't warned about, against a garrison that was ready for them, because the systems that were supposed to protect them had failed more than a year before they existed as a unit. What they accomplished in those 6 months, and on that one catastrophic night, belongs in the record. They drove the trucks into the desert. They wore the boots through the perimeter wire. They held the coastal battery long enough for it to matter, briefly, until it didn't anymore. They walked a month through open desert rather than surrender the names of the men they'd served with. The memo that created them is 51 words long and marked "Most Secret." It doesn't come close to doing justice to what those words described. There was no formal inquiry into Operation Agreement. No board of officers convened to examine why the Tobruk garrison had been on high alert, why the coastal batteries had been pre-sighted on the landing approaches, why 2 simultaneous raids on the same night both found prepared positions rather than sleeping defenders. The operation was written up, absorbed into the institutional memory of the Desert War as one of its expensive failures, and left there. Fellers received the Distinguished Service Cross. He was promoted. He was never told, officially or otherwise, what his cipher had cost. The Army managed the Black Code breach the way institutions typically manage catastrophic systemic failures, quietly, without ceremony, and without assigning blame to anyone still present who might suffer from accountability. Fellers wasn't a traitor. The British radio operators in the desert weren't negligent by the standards of their day. The planning staff at GHQ Cairo weren't reckless. Every individual in this story did what they were trained to do and trusted the systems they'd been given. Those systems had already failed them in an embassy office in Rome 14 months before the first landing craft hit the water at Tobruk. Shadle's description of how the good source functioned, intelligence so precise that by lunchtime his staff knew Allied troop positions from the previous evening, describes a capability that, even after it ended on June 29, 1942, had shaped how Axis commanders read every subsequent piece of British signal traffic. The contextual map it built didn't expire with the channel. It informed a garrison commander's sense of what constituted suspicious activity. It informed Rommel's assessment of which targets remained on British planners' lists after the fall of Tobruk. It made the desert radio traffic generated by British forces in August and September 1942 legible in ways that traffic wouldn't have been to an intelligence service starting from zero. That is the architecture of how Operation Agreement was undone. Not one radio call, 1,000 transmissions over 14 months, none of them individually fatal, each of them contributing one more brick to a wall that by September 1942 had enclosed the British plan entirely, without anyone on the British side knowing the wall existed. On the morning of the 14th of September 1942, as the sun came up over the Libyan coast, Tobruk harbour was essentially undamaged. The fuel depots were intact, the dock facilities were intact. The coastal guns that had destroyed HMS Seek and driven HMS Coventry's crew into the sea were still in Axis hands, still loaded, still manned. Rommel's supply lines continued to function. The force sent to destroy them was gone, sunk at sea, captured on the beaches, scattered into the desert, lying on ground they had briefly held before being overwhelmed. HMS Sikh had been the last ship seen still firing as the flames took her. The Royal Marines of the 11th Battalion, the young men whose names are now sewn into an embroidered memorial held by a collector in England. Names like Marine Leslie Rogers, aged 19, and Sergeant Alfred Dray, aged 26, had landed on the wrong beach and died in the dark. Haselden, cotton merchant's son, Arabic speaker, intelligence corps officer, veteran of more behind-the-lines operations than most men his age had any right to survive, was dead at 39 on ground he had spent 6 days crossing a desert to reach. 6 weeks later, Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein. By November 1942, the Axis had begun their long retreat past Tobruk. The port they had defended against Britain's most ambitious raid fell without a fight, rendered irrelevant by the broader collapse of Axis North Africa. The men of Operation Agreement weren't defeated on the beaches. They weren't defeated by superior Axis tactics or overwhelming German firepower or failures of British courage. The plan was good. The men executing it were among the most capable the British Army had. What defeated them was the invisible war, the war of frequencies and codebooks and embassy safes, a war that had been fought and lost in the months before any of them knew their operation existed. They deserved to know what they were walking into. Nobody on the British side knew either. That is the most disturbing thing about Operation Agreement, and the thing that most resists comfortable resolution. The catastrophe wasn't hidden from the men who died in it. It was hidden from everyone. Subscribe for more stories like this.